discussion panel. So first of all, we'll exchange some thoughts as during the opening session, and then the floor will be open for discussion. So if you have any questions to our panelists, then feel free to ask them. With me today are Dipendion, whom I already introduced during his lecture, Professor Krzysztof Jóźwiak from Medical University of Lublin, a pharmacologist, researcher in receptor ligand interactions, mostly right now, and oh my, two microphones, now it's stereo. Okay, so yeah, it may be twice as loud.
Twice as important.
Yeah, twice as important. And Professor Krzysztof Palczewski from Cleveland, who is a world-class expert in the chemistry and function of vision, including the rhodopsin protein. So today, subject is a kind of a mixed bag. First of all, we'd like to talk about issues with mentoring young people, and seeing all the young faces out there, it might be pertinent to your careers. And then we'll switch whether this mentoring can be expanded into collaborating with people from different worlds, different science fields, and whether these such interdisciplinary teams actually have a right to exist right now in the current world. So first of all, I'd like to ask Professor Palczewski, what's your idea on how you deal with new young people in your lab? What's your approach to them?
I would say shortly, severely. And now, in all seriousness, I had a chance to work with about 125 people over my scientific career. And I have seen people who are committed for what they do, and those who were just coming through and found the reason to be for that particular time in the lab. But in general, it is really a very special group of very passionate people about what they do. And if they love the project, they develop that project. If they don't like, I can tell you, the first symptom is that that colleague of mine, he has a better project than mine. And that's very first symptom. That means that, again, there is not much interest of developing its own project. So I think, again, it is a beautiful job. I mean, there is no other job. It many aspects. It requires long hours, pay little, and but it's stable. It's virtually, we do not know colleagues who lost their job over the career. They can dedicate themselves into understanding something of a great interest for that particular person. The second thing, I would just not maybe coherently have a story to answer on that. The second symptoms, when you look at the people or talk with interviewing people, this particular ex-student was with Dr. Smith, and he really doesn't like Dr. Smith, but spent 6 years with him. And so it's just like, this is like immediate. So you're not that bright that you spend that long with that particular professor. And why I'm saying that is that, again, the selection with whom you wanted to work is extremely important. And there's no slavery. So it is both ways, commitment of PI to providing resources and intellectual environment, colleagues and everything else. But on another hand, also is your commitment to be because you wanted to be there. And so this is very critical, those two things, that the project you have, if it's not good, make it good. And the second, if the group where you are is not suitable for your interest or whatever other reasons you cannot fully develop, you're wasting everybody's time. And I think that criteria you need to think. Now, not all of the 125 people that went through my lab, I think I have 25 who become PIs. So not all of them, most of them didn't make it in a certain way. But acquiring knowledge and the scientific methods is going to benefit for the rest of your life. So this is really something very important to think about. This, it's a training of how to obtain new information. And even if you switch to another job, you will be doing this job very well with scientific rigor. And that's, again, the beauty of continuous education.
Perfect, thank you. Krzysztof, any words on that?
First of all, I couldn't agree more with Krzysztof, so this is not much to add.
His name is Krzysztof too.
Yeah. Yes. It is very important to have interesting projects and to have the good proposition for people you are hiring. And one thing I could add here is that, at least in my case, I'm trying to have a very interdisciplinary team. So I'm trying to mix bioinformaticians with biologists, with chemists, and so on. And this is, I think, the environment which might be additionally attractive for a young person who is considering to stay in science, is considering to get involved in some interesting project. So first of all, you need to have an interesting project, but also, at least this is my observation, I see some passion when the biologists are trying to talk and trying to learn bioinformatics, or a chemist who never do any experiments in biology, and by the condition of the project has to talk with a biology person to discover a new field of science, first of all, and also to discover new ways of communication. You know, the chemists and biologists, they can talk about the same thing, but they will use different language. So this is also important, that I see how it is important and important for them to learn those new things.
Depends, and I think the most competitive environment for a young researcher to be in is probably right now Boston, and you have a lot of people working in the Dana-Farber and the other institutes you have there. So what do you look for in an applicant, because you have to screen through a lot of applications? So how do you choose your people?
Publications.
Yeah.
You know, at the end of the day, I get a lot of, I mean, the labs at the at Harvard Medical School, we have very few students. We have a graduate program, but there are many labs, and students are a relative minority. These labs are postdoc driven, and you get applications from all over the world, and it's very difficult to evaluate those applications because I don't know what's the best university in Iran or in Poland. Łódź is, of course, of course. But the reality is that the one common denominator is I know the papers and I can read the papers. And unfortunately, even though it sounds harsh that people do a lot of work and things don't get published, it's very hard to evaluate a candidate without peer-reviewed papers. And I would just tell PhD students, the one thing that PhD students I talk to them is that they're very, very eager to graduate. I think more than trying to graduate quickly is to get the papers out. Don't try to graduate, because you will not get to the next stage if you don't get all your papers out. So for me, that's a key criteria. And then the interview process. In my lab, we try to do it a little, I would say a little bit democratically, where the candidate comes and they might have great papers, but they spend the day with my people. They go, and I'm not there. They go to lunch, and then I talk to everybody in my lab, and people give me their feedback. And there have been instances where somebody with a fantastic CV, we have not offered them a position because people didn't felt that this person would not be a good fit. It's not very often. And I'm not saying it happens all the time, but ultimately the person has to be in the lab, has to fit in the lab, and it's a relatively small group, 8 to 10 people. So these are the two things I would look for.
Another thing is motivation, because you say papers. Well, obviously, if you want to publish a lot of low-level papers, it's fairly easy to do right now. But if you're saving the results for one big work, a Nature Cell or something else, it takes a lot of effort, time, and it requires constant motivation despite all the hurdles you mentioned. So how do you deal with that?
Low-level, high-level it's very relative. It's very hard to. I don't expect a PhD student all the I mean, I barely get an applicant who has a Nature Cell Science paper. You get some very rare. That's not, the reality is if you have a paper in a reasonable journal, you have a complete body of work and you can present that work and it's been peer reviewed. To me, that's important. It's a JBC paper or a, obviously if it's a Nature paper, probably you have faced a very competitive environment. That is an added advantage. But, you know, most of my postdocs come with 1 or 2 decent papers, and it's very relative. It's very hard to say what is and what is not, and then you have to take circumstances in mind, because somebody in a smaller place with less resources, it's hard to publish a very high level paper. I mean, how do you expect this person to do it? But if they have a decent paper, the recommendations are strong, they come and present and they can tell their story, that's okay for me. But finishing a project and getting it published, and again, I have to say, I understand there's a level of unfairness here because it's not up to the student. If they were in a lab which takes too long, or the PI doesn't like sending a paper, and I see this all the time. But from my end, it's harder to evaluate somebody without a paper, but it doesn't have to be some sensational paper. It's more a complete body of work which the student can convey.
How do you inspire your students?
Well, I think by example. I think that's the best motivator. As parent and as a mentor, particularly children, as you perhaps noticed, the small little babies, they cannot speak, they're laying down and they're watching you. They know and extract and every information they can get. So you cannot be fake. You can't be PI to fake that, you know, you work hard so I may just have a better life. So you committed along with the students. I would just also digress and comment exactly what you said. The Nature papers, you will come to my lab and you will be doing there. But now, if you have that complete story from A to Z, the design of the project, execution, all controls, logical, in respected journal, this is really pretty solid. The other thing is you can just do a wonderful experiment and keep it in desk, and that doesn't do any good to anybody. And so those people who do not publish, they in many private conversations, they will tell you that, you know, counting paper doesn't count. Not having any paper and having data in a desk doesn't count for nothing. This is zero. So I think it is important. It's important. Not every story belongs to more high-profile journals. They are story, they are solid brick that adds to building the wall. So I think that's something that is complete, that it is well done and well executed, and it goes to the journal depending on a current fashion to some degree as well. So I think this is very important and your question going back now, once I said that, I do not know, but how to motivate people beyond really certain level. You will not believe, when I was in high school, I wanted to do science. I knew I would work on vision. In high school, I knew I'm going to go that from the chemical point of view, how our vision works. And for me, anything else, seeing a 35-year-old person or 28, not knowing what this person wants to do in life is a shocker. That's shock number one. And then it needs constant motivation. How could you motivate? That's beyond. It is maybe finding a relationship that there's a productivity coming from the person. But if you don't have a passion and drive, and the only criterion is to know. I wanted to know why this is made this way and this signal transduction is happening this way without yet getting rewards, awards, and everything else. That's perhaps enough. But if you don't have that drive, it's very hard in science because you continuously attack that you did something wrong. Your competitors telling you that you have no idea what you're saying. You know, it is an exposure of your personality, your drive, your passion all the time. So if you do not believe what you're doing, I very, very strongly believe, and you want it to excel, and you don't want it to be dilettante. I think the dilettante is the worst thing in science, that the fellow who thinks knows, but it really doesn't know anything. It doesn't need to know everything, but at least in some area has to be expert. So honestly, I have tried many pedagogical way of motivating people. There are those ways. There are financial rewards. There are meetings. There are many ways: conversation, discussion, doing experiment together, writing paper together. There are many, many. I will not reveal everything because you will be too knowledgeable. And if some of them you will end up in my lab, it will be disaster because you will know everything what I'm doing. But in a sense, in addition to those papers, what you mentioned, I think that in interview for me is to understanding whether that person has a drive. I remember once I interviewed a person who came from Belgium, and she was a molecular biologist or virologist, and didn't have many good papers. It was in a lab that really the PI retired, and when I spoke with her, I couldn't just, I was so excited because she was so driven that she wanted to do, this will be her prime time now to accomplish what she wanted to do. And indeed, I hired her, and a colleague of mine, like she was sitting here, she said, well, really? You can get a better people than that. And as it happened, she was the best. And when she was leaving, all my successes were because of her. And that's really true. She was one of the best molecular biologists. So I think this drive is the second thing, and I think it's innate property of a human being. Whether, as I said, and I think you heard me, if you're interested in life, are you interested in life? It's whatever is happening around you. Are you interested in it? Whether there's a purpose of knowing or not, but are you interested? Or you just this receiving box that the things are coming to you, and you consume and consume rather than to know. And I think that is something, you know, in knowing a little bit of history and literature, history of your part of your research. What is amazing, we had a student, my department has historically 3 Nobel laureates, and I sat there during the defense, and it was wonderful. 2 Nature Communication papers, 2 PNAS papers as a graduate student. It was reasonable. And I sit there was no question to ask technically. So I asked him if he knows who discovered cyclic AMP and who discovered cyclic GMP. And those were the faculty from the department. Al Gilman, discovery of G protein. And he had no clue. 0. And how could you? I mean, there is a display on a corridor. You go every time, every whatever hours you go and you see that, and you didn't even pay attention. What is that? So this interest in life, guys, this is really very, very important.
Yeah. So this is probably, I think, to remember, right? We're not looking for people who will write the papers, but people who will discover things, right? That's and who will want to discover things. Krzysztof, you mentioned you have a team of interdisciplinary people. How you deal with their expectations, because I guess both financial and professional expectations of a bioinformatician and a molecular biologist are vastly different, right? And motivating them is probably also a challenge. So,
yes, and but I would like to make some comment on the previous things. Well, first of all, maybe your student was so focused on research that he didn't read any plates on the walls and so on. But indeed, the important thing I wanted to mention is something which I think is more local Polish type of thing, and I think this is also important to say here. At our universities, we have many students, really a great number of students, and not always, not all of them, they really have a chance to get into some interesting projects. And I know that many of them are looking for interesting projects. And if you offer them something, they really are very attracted by this, and they really can be very motivated into making this research and so on. So very important from our point of view at our institutions is showing them a good science, because they not necessarily have the chance to have any contact with good science, good laboratories, and showing the science which we are doing in the laboratory and showing how people are doing science abroad. So sending on the conferences, sending on some internship to different laboratories, to our partners. Usually we all have a project which are international, so we have international collaboration, sending those people, and then it opens the eyes. You know, those people, they see that the science might be very, very attractive and very rewarding, but only when you really is lucky enough to find the good environment to exercise that. I had a chance. I was very lucky because I had a chance to have this type of experience, and now I do my best to do similar experience to my people.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a good time for a bit of a couple of questions from the audience. So if any of you are curious of what our panelists expect from people who are applying to their departments or who want to collaborate with them, now it's a good time to ask.
But only for those who are interested in life.
Yeah, obviously. So the others, just wait. Yeah. Do we have a question? Oh, yeah, there's one.
It's a great panel. I'm actually a relatively young PI. And the question of motivating students and selecting the best students, the best postdocs, is very relevant to me. And as a young PI, I cannot really attract, the very, very top talent. And obviously, I have to select from the candidates that I have, and not all of them have, great papers, and not all of them have this, extreme drive. And the question is, if you're working with maybe people who are not so driven, are there ways to kind of having them acquire this drive, maybe infecting them with the enthusiasm?
Well, my first.
It's working.
Yeah, okay. My first comment is it's a cliche, but you're your best postdoc. And it'll be that way for a long time. So you better get used to the fact that initially you can't expect people who are as good as you were, or most people who go to the bigger labs. So that's one. Second is, it's very hard to intrinsically motivate somebody, but the environment also creates motivation. So creating an environment where there are some people, and you see that in any lab, and I've been around a lot of big labs, and mine isn't that big, but again, being where I am, there are some people, no matter what, they will have a certain work ethic and they will work hard and read and do something. They don't need anything. And then there are others that if there are people around them, if somebody is coming early and leaving late, they might just to be around these people, they will get motivated to push themselves. So just creating a good work ethic and recruiting people, to me, the first thing is work ethic, because I think ideas and intelligence are a little overrated at this stage. We can come up with ideas. There's a lot of things to be done. You have to have obviously an intrinsic excitement. But my PhD advisor would always say, ideas are a dime a dozen. Let's do them. And there are 10,000 reasons not to do them because, oh, this won't work, or we don't know that thing. So there are people, you can talk yourself out of any experiment. But if you create initially, like with yourself in the lab, and a couple of good people who are willing to just spend the hours, then the next folks just get into that habit. But, if it becomes a very 9-to-5 lab from the beginning, it's very difficult to reverse that trend. So my advice would be, or I don't know whether advice is the right word, my suggestion, you still have to get lucky that you get some people like that, but you don't necessarily need the brightest person on the planet. If you get somebody who's at least willing to work hard, and you can provide the guidance by being there physically, that goes a long way.
Leading by example, right?
I think this is absolutely right. So this is really a conversation to students, but also to PIs. I have, in the last 13 years as a chair of pharmacology, I've been involved in hiring about 16 people. So N is 16. And I see now from perspective of that time when I made mistake and why did I get these people. So very often, if they coming from very large lab, They coming in and they trying to mimic what their bosses in prior job did. They lock themselves in an office, they get on the phone with everybody, they write grants, they don't even show up in a lab. It's not going to work. And I think I will second that you have to be in a lab and they will be with you. So yes, initially you're going to get people who are less competitive, because particularly if you're a competitive place, they will go to bigger names where they can get that important paper of the life. So, but if you're in a lab and you have intelligent people, you will make it happen.
Do you want to comment on? No. Okay. So do we have any other comments from the audience?
I just had
yeah,
one. Sorry,
yeah, of course.
sorry to dominate the discussion. I just had one other question. How do you deal with helping people through difficult moments in the project? There is always, every project has a slump, phase where you don't know what's going on. There are technical difficulties, and many people, again, if you have somebody with super drive, they will get through this no problem. But there are people who really lose motivation at this point, and they may resign, or they will just start, cruising and things peter out. So how do you help people through that? Through those difficult times in the project?
I can again go to example of that had big impact on me. So of course I know life through my own eyes. I don't have a second experience, but I remember in Poland I was working on enzyme and chemical modification, and we didn't have a good equipment to do protein sequencing, and this was really very hard to do with the methods which we had. And at some point my boss sent me to US to one of the best sequencing lab at that time, and everything went so quickly, and I came back and really had a different perspective. So I think this already has been said, that as a PI you just should send at one critical point like that, you can just send to another colleague for a month to get a different perspective, to change environment, maybe get a different equipment and get different expertise, maybe excite and refresh excitement in the project. Those are again psychological or pedagogical tools that you have in your disposal. So if you open-minded to make it happen, what will take to make it happen? If you have to make that student a coffee every morning, just do it. It's not such a big deal. It's much less pain to making coffee than to be stagnant in project. Wouldn't you agree?
Sure. No, I'm happy to make coffee for my students. Any candidates here?
Where is your lab?
Sorry?
Where is your lab?
It's in Warsaw, University of Warsaw.
So, I mean, I can, this is a definitely good perspective, but it's really hard to send a student from Harvard Medical School somewhere else for a piece of equipment or technique. It's really something we have there. So what I typically do in my lab is, usually people have multiple projects, and I motivate them to work on both at some, particularly early on when things have not taken off. And it's very rare that everything is going down. If everything is going down, then there is something problematic, fundamental with this person's, like how their techniques. Usually one goes down and one goes up. And so when one is down, I try to say, okay, step back. There's no point repeating the same. I mean, the worst thing is to repeat an experiment without making any changes. It's not going to suddenly start working. I think that's the things which students and postdocs do, and it drives me nuts. And around me there are people who have fired people for doing that, because they think it's the most, as a scientist, that's not a very smart thing to do. That today the experiment didn't work, you did everything, you're going to do the same thing tomorrow, and suddenly your bands are going to appear. It makes no sense. So sometimes we don't know, so take a step back and work on the other thing. And other times, really go back, sit with them and show patience, and really go back and let's go back, few steps. This worked. Okay, X is not working. Let's just go back a few steps and start from. There are some feel-good experiments in every lab, some things that work. Let's go do the feel-good experiment and get our confidence back, because continuously getting negative results is terrible for everybody. It's like continuously getting our papers rejected or grants rejected. It's the same thing. So you kind of have to, jiggle it a bit.
This is even more complicated in a lab. Cell biology, they always get some pictures. Computational people get computational thing. The structure biology is the most difficult, and most difficult with the students that, again, he will or she will not graduate unless get the structure. And more than half of my lab does structure biology. And so will you pick a very difficult project and try to crystallize that complex that is very difficult? And this was really a difficult decision to be made, because you knew that if that complex is accomplished, this is going to be a major discovery. If it's not, there will be no PhD. So it's a pretty daunting, yes or no kind of answer, in particular in structure biology. And in this case, you have to have several projects. Those that is just labor intense and will produce the paper. Fortunately, with the cryo-EM right now, things are getting better for structural biologists, because if you're good biochemist and the protein is large, you will get the structure one way or another. Maybe resolution is only issue. Fortunately, because this is really major. With student, virtually you cannot. When we work on crystallization of rhodopsin, this was a really heroic work. You couldn't put a student on that. Yeah. This will just simply not work, because they have every 3 months thesis committee meeting and progress what has to be done, and the difference between this 3 months and next 3 months is virtually no difference. And so one has to think as a PI what projects will be suitable for the student, that it can grow. And it will be at the end some golden end with the PhD thesis. If you put in a project that is too difficult and it is a little bit on luck, how could you tell what one protein will crystallize or not the other? Yeah. You don't.
Yeah, just a small thing which came to my mind. Yesterday we talked about a brand new paper showing that every big figure in science, they have some hobby, some outside activity, which was something like was used by those people, like a strategy to reset and to make a fresh look at something. So maybe just to give a 1 week break for this person, to go for, I don't know, rock climbing, fishing or whatever, and with no expectation, just leave them for some small moment and make them to reset their mind, and maybe they come up with some new ideas on when they have some larger perspective on the projects.
Yeah.
So everybody's projects are going to start failing after that.
Yeah. So a thing to remember is that when you get the second or third or fifth project, it's not that we are trying to overwork you to death. We're caring for you, and we just want to make you grow. So this is positive, right? Okay. So do we have any other questions from the audience? Yeah. There we go. Oh, there was one thing. The one at the back was the first. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I have actually a little bit similar question to what was discussed already. Actually, this is very, very simple question. I mean, how to what you can say to young person, right? Who wants to who decides whether to start scientific career, for example. This is about motivation. What is the final motivation? Right, whether this is a fame, international networking, maybe doing interesting things, but interesting, for who, right? For him or for others. Maybe some, maybe money, even awards. It's very difficult to say if you are hiring someone, right? You are a responsible person, right? You should say something which is true. You shouldn't mislead anybody, right? And for example, people, good programmers, for example, is very difficult to find a good programmer, for example, right? For science. Now, good programmers are going to business typically, and if you want to, say the truth to this person to encourage such person to work. Yeah, this is really difficult. I mean, I don't know what to say, right? Because I'm just finishing here. Because in business they're getting double the salary, which typically even good salary at PhD, right? You can give to someone, right? So there's a little dilemma for me, to being honest and really help someone, not help myself, but help someone and kind of being in agreement with everything. Yeah.
But when you go to graduate school, right now NIH introduced those kind of essay for 1 page, why you what you wanted to accomplish. It agitates me completely. If you go to graduate school, you're going there to get PhD. That's your purpose. So that's how you motivate your student that they wanted to get PhD. Then they will have many different opportunities in life, in job, more interesting job. So that's one. If they are postdocs, then they will have a chance to be either to go to industry and become a leader in their team, or so this is relatively simple. You just have to care about them and also be like a parent for them. I didn't understand that, to be frank. I knew intellectually, but I didn't understand until my son was doing PhD. And we will be talking once a week about something or another. How was that? And I didn't want to tell him his PI is wrong all the time. So I said nothing, never, and listen only. And in 1 week, his PI didn't smile to him. The next week, he smiled too much, so he wants something. The 3rd week, he didn't see him. And I just listened to that and realized, how sensitive and fragile this person is, that it's so dependent on the PI. And I think that personal contact, in a sense of spreading wings over this young soul to move things forward, is extremely important. I think this is not what you're going to say. It has to be honest. It has to be that there is a path forward for that young person. I did absolutely not realize, and then I started listening to the other student, and I see the same phenotype. It's just like, right? Our students, they're feeling that the PI didn't smile, didn't meet, didn't make coffee at morning, neglect in one way or another, or was overprotective, it didn't leave the room to grow. It's continuously, So I think that there is a simple answer and very complicated answer. Simple answer is the students, when they come to graduate and learn to be prepared for the profession. If they postdocs, either they dream to have their own lab, or they're spending postdoc to get more training, to do something else in life.
Okay. Just one sentence about the motivation. If someone asks me why I'm in science, I think the shortest answer, because I'm on my own way to self-perfectness. Right, so this is always something which I'm trying to get, and I'm trying to be better than I used to be. So, and this is just fun, just a very fun strategy for life. Thank you.
So, on that note, a question to our panelists. You say that's a good point. You want to be better than yourselves, but you'll probably, given that your teams are continuously growing and expanding, you will get competition with people who want to be better than the other team members, right? So how do you deal with that competitiveness? Do you encourage it, or do you think it's detrimental? And how do you cope with having people who are motivated by being better than the other ones, even at the expense of the team's good?
Within your team?
Yeah. Well, it will happen eventually, right? If you have an expanding team, then obviously some people will be
I think it's
motivated.
a matter of what you want with your lab. I mean, if you want a huge lab and you want people, but I don't think it's very, it doesn't have to be that people are competitive with each other within a team. Yes, they don't have to be best friends, but if everybody's project is distinct and there's clear discussion about who does what and how the movement goes, I don't see, and this is something I see around me, so this is coming from experience. I don't think it's healthy to have intra-lab competition, which is very apparent and intense.
On that, I think we all agree. But the thing is that the PhD students will be competing for the same resources eventually, for the same scholarships, the same awards, and so on, right? So well, there will be, in a way, in a race, right? So this is the thing, that whether do you like to motivate them for that, or
well,
or
I think it's a broader question. As I generally like to tell both PhD students and postdocs that science is a marathon. There is no point sprinting. I mean, just keep patient, get your paper. If the other person is publishing a big paper and you feel demoralized because your paper is not big, which can happen, you just have to, it's about putting a solid piece of work together. And there are thousands of examples in history where the citation of a relatively obscure paper is 1,000 times more than a Nature paper that was published at the same time, because that so-called obscure paper is correct and complete, and we only realize that. I'm not necessarily saying that the Nature paper is incorrect, but I try to tell them, just hold, your time will come, or be patient. I mean, this is really about patience. Science is all about being patient. So it's not a race which can be won in a PhD or even in a foreseeable time. It's really, I think I really like the concept. It's almost a race with yourself of trying to improve. So if it's hard to get that in the short term if you're applying for grants together, but I typically discourage. I don't have a situation where two people from my lab are applying for something at the same time. We try to sort it out way before and make it clear, okay, you apply for X and you apply for Y. It happens in bigger labs, and what I've seen of that is never good. So
I don't. I think everything was so beautifully said that I think there's no time for that spending on this. Usually the grant, so some PIs are, and I'm sure you heard that, if you leave my lab, you cannot take my project with you. I just never understood that. There's no censorship. You can do what you want. Your application is your application, not your colleague application. It's you, and you how you're going to make that application, what you're going to put forward as a proposal. So coming even from one lab at two different people on very similar topic, it's usually not detrimental. It may be detrimental if they're going with the same cycle of application, but if they spread over the following cycle, there is no reason to worry. It is your intellectual product at the end of the day, paper and the grant application, right? So,
so don't be afraid to share.
Don't be afraid, and the PI cannot tell you you cannot take that project. You're going to do whatever you heck wanted to do, and that's all. You may not get reagents, or you may have to compete with much larger lab. That's the reality that you have to realize. But typically in the lab, one person at the end of the day, if it's very good, knows more than the rest of the lab on that particular topic. So anyway, it will be much more competitive than the remaining lab of the PI who has many more other projects.
Yeah. Okay, so don't be afraid to share and cooperate with your colleagues, right? You had a question, I think.
Have you worked with better students than you, the more talented, and how you develop them? How you support the people that you find, the talented people that you thought that maybe can make in the future quite big careers, scientific or business work?
Student outgrowing the master, right?
Yeah, you love that, right? And you think still that you're the smartest because you had that smart student. So as a PI, you winner anyway. So I think I don't see underlying question. Of course, we want the best from our students. What I have been doing with my own hands until associate professor, I'm not competitive with them anymore. I mean, what they can do is I'm not competitive. And you know, with age, the hearing goes a little bit, the sight goes a little bit, the pleasure shift to something else. So those young students, they must be better. Otherwise, there will be no progress.
And I think this is a dream of every teacher to have a student which is outgrowing the teacher after all.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much.
I have a question related to what was said. I'm not asking how you find it when your student outgrows you, but do you have a method how to help them? I mean, if he is better than you, you can no longer teach him meritorically. So how do you help him?
I think this is a term of mentoring. At some point you are not teaching anymore, you are just become a friend, and you are looking at the person, and you are taking care that this person makes proper decisions and, you know, grows in a proper direction. But also these are smart people, so, you know, so they might have different ideas and different perspectives. So this is also important to give them as much freedom as possible in their research projects and their research future.
Your end point is not your PI or your colleagues or your competitor. The end point is to understand problem that you set to understand. And so you're not fighting in a quotation with your boss. You already passed that. You're technically better. You know even how to turn on centrifuge. So you're already more clever than your boss. But what it is all about is that your challenge is intellectual challenge. And as a job, as a scientist, you're exploring unexplored area of nature. And so I wouldn't put this in a question as you put it. I would say this lab, this environment allows me to reach to the levels that otherwise wouldn't be possible, that this is a conducive environment for achieving a better progress in understanding of the problem. That's how I would see it.
Dependent?
Yeah, there are a few. I mean, I get where you're coming from. So the first thing is, if it is really true that you feel intrinsically that this is a brilliant person and is really going to take it to the next level, you should provide resources and get out of the way. But I will tell you this too. At least when you start your lab, a lot of people come to your lab, and because maybe you're young, and sometimes when I started, my postdocs were older than me, they assume suddenly that they are better than you. And you can't be heavy-handed about it. They are not better than you. They are not better than you just because they think so, and you're not better than them just because you have a lab. So I think the way to do it is to have a dialogue. Say, okay, so I have specific instances when there is an idea, and the student, in this case a postdoc, says, I want to do it in this way, but there is no scientific reason for it. This person says, I just think this is going to work. And from my perspective, I have a different idea. And say in both cases, we don't have papers or data backing each other. My philosophy in that case is great. Do your way, but do my way too. And we'll see. But you have to do both ways if you're working in my lab. So when I was a postdoc, this would be my boss tells me to do something. If I cannot convince her that my idea is better, I would do both. And whichever works. At the end of the day, we are on the same side. We want the thing to work. But when you're young at an early stage of your career, there is an element of getting, I would say, you get very confident. But there are so many aspects to science. You can teach this person how to deal with editors. You can teach this person how to write a grant. It's not just, science is not confined to do an experiment and get a result. So, but these are the different aspects.
Yeah. There was a question at the back. Yeah, I see you.
I have a question. You have been in PIs for a long time, and you are proficient in being PIs. You know how to motivate students, how to mitigate conflicts.
We just said we can't motivate students.
Yeah, but you try. You're doing your best, I believe. But when you look at yourself back then, when you were just young PIs, what knowledge you didn't have then that you have now that would be crucial to actually be a good PI? So what would you recommend to young PIs? What should they learn at the beginning to actually be good PIs?
Travel back in time. So what would you say to your younger self?
Again, I think we already discussed that the best thing you can do is to be in a lab. and to be with people when you start your lab. Don't try to mimic your far older, more established PI, because that is the death. You're going to lose contact with people, you're going to lose technically. They're not going to train that quickly, so you're going to have a gap in productivity from the lab, so you're not going to get. So stay in a lab as long as you possibly can. And right now, I'm sure it's not pretty picture when I one day wake up and I wanted to go and do experiments, and that is not a good picture. But at that time, I'll be in a lab. I knew every experiment that was going on in the lab. I was competitive in a sense, not competitiveness of competition, but competitiveness in terms of knowledge, how to do those experiments. And so the younger people will come and they just starting. They require that. So I think this is very important. I will also say something that I see grants from Poland as well. Of course, we're all serving on multiple panels and see applications. You need to have a directions, a very clear directions, what you wanted to do. You will be surprised how many PIs do not have a clear picture what they wanted to accomplish. Seems to be almost like not possible, but it is possible. I can assure you, people, they know how to do NMR, so they have this protein, whatever protein, and nobody studied this in acetonitrile, so they will study in acetonitrile. And that fundamental question, why? Why? I think this is really the thing that is absolutely almost oppressive. Why do you do that? Is that the best way to do it? I think it's so critical. So if I will go back and see where mistakes were made and what I could do better and what we did well, because there was a very clear, we wanted to go there and this is why. And if you can explain to somebody, to your aunt who is not a scientist, that is a good why. If this is so complicated that nobody understands, even in your institute, that's not a good why. It is lost. It is lost in technicality, it's lost intellectually. It doesn't have a clarity of explanation why. So I think we're all guilty. I think we have here a senior PI. Is it not a frightening? You need to know where you're going, right? You need to go and do things because you wanted to know. This is the piece of missing science that you wanted to explore. I will spend more on that why than on and stay in a lab. Those are the two things I will have strongest preference to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you want to add something? No? Were there any other questions? I think there was one at the back, but wait. No. Okay. So another. There's one. Yeah. Oh, even two of them. No, sorry, one. Perfect. Thank you.
This is a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much for all the remarks. But as I was listening to you, there was a lot of questions about motivating people, about how do you develop people scientifically, their scientific career. But there's also a matter of managing people in your laboratory. And I saw it on my own eyes, a young PI struggling with her master's students to establish a good communication, to resolve internal problems which were growing because of their different characters, basically. They wanted they were pretty much motivated, but they have different characters, and the problems were growing internally. And I didn't saw any reaction from the manager of the lab, from her boss, to help her resolve those problems. So how do you develop your people in terms of like soft skills, like managing people?
I think you answer on your question. When you have a large organization, either department or your own lab or subgroup or group or colleague, any conflict needs to be resolved momentarily. You know, from that thing that somebody drink your milk from freezer and you don't solve it, month later is resentment. Month later it is 7 times of the same thing happen, and it become unsolvable. And so I think that's very, very important that any PI, supervisor, whatever capacity, act on a conflict momentarily. And usually just a simple conversation, just a simple explanation what happened and how they see. Sometimes you have to just move them either physically or move from the topics that are not interdependent. They can be related, but not interdependent. And I think this does happen, but I can tell you this is the biggest challenge for PI, because you're really job, then it becomes 7 days a week, 24 hours. It's just whatever it happened, you act on it. And if you let it brew for a few days, then you will have department divided by this group of faculty, the lab divided by the blue team and red team, and all of that. So, like you said, this person didn't intervene at proper time, and it is too late. And it's usually much more dramatic solution for that problem. Yeah. Actually, before coming here, I had a student, MD, PhD student and postdoc, and they were working together, and the problem is very difficult, and then suddenly one felt competitive toward the other. And again, sitting with them, 3 of us, and discussing how this can be done that is acceptable to everybody, and yet it goes toward the goal of solving the problem, diffuse the situation momentarily. Yeah. Otherwise, you will have to do more drastic solutions.
Yeah. Although we need to know it, right? So you have to have a structure for dealing with that, and the PIs need to know about these problems that are brewing. So when we ask what's going on, what's wrong, then don't be afraid to tell your boss that this and he or she drank my milk, right? And that's an issue for me. Or otherwise we just don't know, right? And we have a lot of stuff going on, a lot of stuff to think of, and we can't micromanage every single thing and deal with every single tier. But if we know the problem, we will not underestimate it, right?
Yeah, it's usually a small thing.
Yeah.
That's how it starts. Very, very small thing. And it grows, it balloons.
I mean, I think this is one of the problems of our field. I think we never get trained to do this. You get trained in every stage of your career to do experiments, think science, but running a lab is a huge amount of people management. So one of the challenges I can say I have faced is diversity. Like I had 8 people from 6 countries at some point in my lab, and there are some cultural differences which you cannot preempt. And you are in the middle of a grant, or you are really stressed about something, and you're somebody, just for the sake of it, my Jamaican technician is offended by my Chinese postdoc. It's very hard, and I know they don't mean badly. It's just that they do things in a certain way, or say some political statement, and this person. So there is no good answer to how you would resolve it, but ignoring it is the worst thing you can do. So you even if you don't know, having an honest conversation or trying to, and I'm not saying it works all the time when you bring them together, it doesn't always work. It would be a lie to say sitting down with them and everything is hunky-dory. No, but at least you know what the problem is, and you can at least keep an eye on it to see it doesn't escalate. But being very, very, I would say, harsh about things. I don't care if my people in the lab are best friends. I just want them to do their experiments and be cordial and collegial, and not be antagonistic. I've tried in the past. I really wanted everybody to be get along and be really, go drink their beer. You can't do that. People, particularly when they're postdocs, different stages of life, families. But as long as they're cordial, civil, that's okay for me.
Okay. Okay. Do you have any other questions? No. One thing, Krzysztof, at the beginning you mentioned you have an interdisciplinary team of bioinformaticians, chemists, biologists. How do you make them speak the same language, or how do you deal with this, different jargons and areas of expertise to combine into something efficient? Is it even possible right now, or should you have separate teams or collaborate instead of forging one interdisciplinary team?
Well, if I recall some beginning of my scientific career, I remember that I was a chemist who dare to be a translator between some informaticians and bioinformaticians and biologists, right? So I discovered, first of all, that those people, even if they talk about the same thing, they use very different language. This is, and always the language is very dependent on the field, on some specializations and so on. So I think the most important thing and very rewarding is to develop some good means of communication between different people. And this is really fun to learn from other people the experience they have, but I don't have. And they can bring me some very interesting ideas, which might be very important for the project. So I think this is very rewarding, and at least from my personal perspective, I really like that, and I really like to learn those communications and those new things. And I think those younger people now, they also have the good experience and passion in talking with people with experience with completely different things, but always they have some common goal at the end of the road.
Okay. Depending on, in contrast, your team is not really interdisciplinary, right? You mostly collaborate with other people. No, but that's a different strategy. You can't do monodisciplinary studies right now, right? But you can either have them all in your own team and try to get a group of people, or you collaborate. And how do you deal with that?
Well, I mean, the structure in the US, as you know, it's about resources. I can't afford to have a chemist and a computational biologist full-time and pay the salary and the benefits. Ideally, I would love to, but it doesn't work for me. When you start out. So I collaborate. So we have chemists and bioinformaticians and structural biologists around, or I find them. One thing I really believe very strongly about is the global aspect of science. It's very important for me. Maybe because I'm coming from India and I do science in Boston. In a weird way, and I'm not saying that everybody should do this, but it gives me a lot of pleasure to do science with people all over the world. So I have collaborators in Greece. My institute has a big fundraiser with the institute in Athens, so we are having a big collaboration. Ironically, the only person presenting at that was me. There were no Greek colleagues. I like this idea of doing science with different countries, and then you get to know them. I mean, Wojciech and I, this is my second visit to Łódź. I would never have thought of coming to Łódź if it wasn't for Wojciech, but we started collaborating, and it's now a really established program. So that is one way. Like if you can convince the person in a different field, you talk your language, you are open to the other person's language, and you find something in between.
One question to the audience from us, actually. I'd like a show of hands. Who of you thinks he or she works in an interdisciplinary team? What do you think of yourselves? Yeah, that's quite a lot of people, right? So, okay, so the last person who dropped the hand can tell us about his or her team. Just out of curiosity, what do you think? What do you think is this? Which strategy will come out on top at the end? The smaller collaborating teams or the larger labs with everybody on board? What do you think? Given the perfect resources, even if you have resources like better than
in the US, most of the lab relies on grants, so-called R01s, which are the individual sponsor proposal, and those are quite limited in amount of money. But there are many large grants, and in Europe particularly, you have European Union, very large grants, and the many applications, the chances of low, but very, very large sum of money is given to teams. And so this is more conversation to PIs from my perspective than to students, is that usually those large applications are fail or they are not very attractive because they are combination. I know our guest here, I know Chris, I know you, I know me, and I will put together and we'll have a grant. And most of the applications are like that, in US as well. So in US there are also large grants, like in our institute we have R24 so-called, and there are 10, $12 million, so $2-3 million a year, which is a very significantly larger grants than R01. And all of the winners, and I sit on largely on those panels, those large grants, all of the winners, if there is a clear defined idea, we wanted to find out this. We wanted to find out, let's say, the cure for malaria, and that's what we wanted to do. And the team gets together and gets selected, not by the people who are the best looking people, but those who can deliver structural biology, those who can deliver chemistry, those that understand the cell cycle of pathogen, that you just select that group. One person has to be leader to put this together. This is really very serious, and it's really much easier if you have that large project to put together. The money is much better, you can do so many more things. The only danger I see with that, if you ask any PI, would you like to collaborate, there will be $500,000 for you. I don't know anyone who would say no, and they will not do anything at the end of the day. So you have to kind of, through other means, sort it out who will deliver and who will use those resources that all together you put to bring this project to fruition, and then you can be accountable. You will have the complementary method. Why would you do, I'm not harping at NMR, why would you do the structure with NMR when you can get perhaps X-ray more useful for drug design, or even cryo-EM? You know, it's just like, is that the best methodology? I have a goal to watch it, to go there, and the best way, the most straightforward are those methodologies. I know the best people who are in this field. Can I coerce them? Can I then monitor the progress and having this done? With this, I think it's a partial solution. Doing this in a lab, it's very difficult because we're doing engineering and we're doing chemistry and structural biology, but this requires a lot of resources. You cannot have one postdoc doing one thing and there is no backup, because that postdoc, if it's good, is going to leave and is going to be PI somewhere else. So you need to have a little bit in depth those technology in your lab, and then the lab balloons to 30, 40 people, and then you're lucky if you know all of the people in the lab names.
Yeah.
So again, I think I strongly will to most talented PI to consider that. But setting up first the project, not setting up the team, and then, well, what can we do then, boys? Can we protein dynamics?
Something with vision.
And it's fishy, and it smells fishy when you read this proposal. And so 90% of them is just like, there's no brainer. This is not. This is a you know, society functional.
Bunch of people wanting money.
And everybody wants money, but if you define that in a very specific way. So there was a lot of kind of discussion about students, but there's no difference between student and PI, even late in a career. We ought to be demanding from ourselves the scientific clarity and competence.
Yeah, that's actually a point I was driving also to competence. How can you actually judge if an interdisciplinary collaborator is competent? You know, if I tell you that I'm going to use some multi-layered autoencoder to optimize hyperparameters and separate the classes, well, it's gibberish, right?
But you know, in the field, and people respect you, and in your area
in your
of
field,
research,
yes, but in the others, right? You need a
no, in your field. I'm saying I don't know your field about doing something. But I know that you respected in this field. I know that you invited to Gordon conferences, and you on study section of this type of research. You know, there are other criteria to know that you're competent, and that's the number one is the competence, right? Think about this. You get sick today, and you have to be operated by a doctor. Would you like to have a dilettante or competent? I know that there are controversies in this subject.
We have
Right.
actually this kind of saying in Poland. It's good. You have a great luck because you'll be operated on by a professor, and he only does 2 operations per year because he's flying over the world. So you're in good hands right now. It's perfect.
Exactly. So you really look for some people who can deliver, who are good, who are respected, who are pushing the boundary of their own sub-discipline, and you will be in good hands. And that things will happen. If it's not going to happen. And it's going to be even a drag. We had, you remember, less and less, we have the P grants, which was like 4 people in a department got together and they submit something, and they may be even 3 very good people, and the one who had to be on a grant, because it was not possible to exclude him. This would be politically incorrect.
But then you would get reviews back, say, we'll give you the money if you exclude him. Then you have to go tell them.
and sometimes the chairman will come in and say, no, you need to take care of it. You divvy up the money the way you got the cut 1/3, but you divvy up somehow. You know, so this kind of things are problematic, and it's not problematic when you set that goal. I wanted to build this car, and I need the engineers, I need the chemists, I need the fuel, engine, and everything, and I have this set of people with this expertise, and you don't need to even love them. They committed to make this project going.
Yeah, I was thinking more of judging the competences of people from different fields, so that you need a bioinformatician, and well, you don't really know the field, and you don't know what's important for them. Not in every field the nature papers are going to be the most important thing right now. You need a competent person, and you can't really judge, right?
You can. I disagree. The promise is that you can. I think I can. If it's productive lab, if it's published in their specialty journals of high quality, if they respected by the field, then you can say that they're good people. They collaborate, they have open mind, and you have good rapport with them. Yeah, we can. Why not? You don't need to know all of this discipline in nitty-gritty, but this element is needed. I had just one very quick story. It was a phenomenal story of my life. I went to Toruń, and we went to an engineer lab with lasers, and there is a dogma in vision that you can only see the light going to about 680 nanometers. And this was Maciej Wojtkowski. And we went there, and I talked with postdoc, and he said, well, I work on a very long wavelength light laser, and we start talking about it. Do you see this laser? Do you see 1,000 nanometers? And he said, yeah, because we have also this laser, and I can see light, so you must see 1,000 nanometers. So you have a phenomenon right now, virtually never described, that long wavelength you can see it. And the hypothesis is that this is 2-photon event. Like you 2-photon microscopy, you have 2-photon isomerization. And what do you need to prove or explore, not necessarily prove? You need electrophysiology. You need quantum chemistry, that those are not prohibited transition. You need biochemistry. We have done that work within half a year, with a bunch of collaborators that had that specialty. This was the most enjoyable project, I think, at the end of the day, that we could prove it from quantum chemistry to the human physiology that you can see 1,000 nanometers, with only exception that the light has to be pulsing light in femtoseconds, you know, and then you see it because you have this 2-photon event and you can prove it. So I think the problem is that you cannot say. So we had to have a quantum chemist. So I look around the field who works in a very similar area and told him about our observation, and the guy was calling every day, you know, because he was so excited. And he was from Italy, actually, it happened.
No, I just wanted to say, I think, Wojciech, your point was that, say, how did we start collaborating? Like, how could I mean, you know, the fact you hadn't published a whole lot, you are not getting invited to Gordon conferences, and you are not on
have some
study
papers
section.
in diabetes, though, so yeah.
Well,
Decent
the
last
issue
year.
is that when, I think his point is where obviously there, if you're an established PI in a field, and I've experienced both sides, when you've become a little more established, you can look around and find somebody and they will talk to you. When you're starting out and you need to do something interdisciplinary, it is hard to find competent person, because as you said, the established person will be say, who the hell are you? Why will I work with you? So
I would say that.
Yeah. So it makes sense. So I think in the beginning, if you, like, in a way, if you happen to meet somebody at a conference or in a setting where you start talking about it, the work proves the competence. You keep working together, you are providing data which I'm trying to validate. If you're doing garbage, it will not validate. If my ideas are really bad, your analysis will show there's nothing there. So over time, you establish that level of trust that, you know what, even though, you know, you may not be in the biggest place in the world, not saying that Bhuj isn't, or you as I say, and whoever you are, but as you start doing work together and you're sending papers out, it gets accepted. Now, I mean, it's an organic process how you develop it. But again, to his point, I had a similar situation where we found a new protein in DNA repair 2 years ago. We happened to find it by, nobody had worked on it. There were 4 papers in the literature people had done, found it in 2 hybrids. It's a dead enzyme, the worst of the worst, like the ortholog of an enzyme which doesn't have catalytic activity. So, and then we felt we needed to do crystal structure with it. So I did look around and I contacted a established crystallographer who's worked in a similar area, and the guy wanted new proteins to crystallize, which is exciting. So he literally would call me every day to work on this, and it was a new experience for me, like, oh my God, did I hand him something? And now, I mean, it's like, but it's been fantastic. So we've done it, we crystallized it, we did the work on it. But it has to be maybe when you are a little more established, when people will think, okay, this guy's not coming to me with, you know, casein kinase 2, and he's so stupid he doesn't know that it's casein kinase 2. So it's it has to be.
So just one more point to that conversation on collaborators. If I look on my notes and how many people we have discussion to collaborate, and at the end, I would say maybe 10% work out, 90% don't. People promise, never deliver. This is the most frequent. So this selection, unfortunately, also required continuous adjustment. This became too difficult. The student left. I don't have resources. This and that, thousands of reasons. Or simply, it's easier to promise rather than to be controversial and say, no, I don't want to work with you on that. Whoever again PIs heard that, nobody will say, no, I don't want to work with you on this. It will be always some in between, like, yeah, let me think, I will get back to you, this and that, promises, then the emails do not get sent and so on. I would say, no, really a few % work, and I think that's a lucky number. Wouldn't you agree that this is true?
Do we have any other questions regarding collaborators or some stories of spectacular failures? Right? Oh, yeah, there's one. Hopefully the first of the two. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We're counting on that.
Would you be willing to collaborate with someone outside of the scientific community, but with industry experience, like commercial success but no publications?
It's very complicated to work with industry. Again, the project cannot be given to students because they need to publish, and most of the commercial outfits do not want it to publish. This is very difficult. So if I would collaborate with the company, which we do, it has to be a first promise that we can publish, and then I can ask students if they're interested in the project. With postdoc, it's a little bit different because they're more experienced. They can do on a site those kind of experience. But it is really working with industry, particularly in pharmacology. It's a very complex because of the proprietary information, the compounds, the idea. The legal aspect is long and very difficult. I have been very enthusiastic. I've been lucky to work with many big pharma. But as I getting a little bit more mature, finally, I just see that this is not compatible with the academia. There are other ways of doing things. You do more in advance and then you go to industry. But to working with it, we just finished some new Talon technology for gene repair. And it's tons of work and it's not going to be published ever. And they got what they wanted, they got experience, they got the data, but there's not much for you. So then you become like a plumber, you know, you come in, you do your work, you do this well, you get paid, you get extra, but you have to be practical. You need a new centrifuge. Maybe that will pay for a centrifuge. So you do this kind of work. So it's a little bit not to be naive in all of it. Depends on the payout. If the payout financially is so low, it's not worth it to work with industry. It's absolutely a strong statement. We need a different model. And this is a different conversation between academia and industry. This has to be definitely a different model, particularly in the US. I think in Poland it's more liberal system, but in US it become oppressive with conflict of interest. It's just almost impossible to do anything. And it came from medicine, where the not that long ago, let's say all of the ophthalmologists will fly to Cancun. The top people, it will be 200 of them, and they will have 3 minutes talk. They will get $5,000 pay honorarium for that talk and pay hotel and transportation. This is absolutely right now impossible. Not that 5,000, zero. So this has evolved, but it used to be completely different. And there were also good collaboration because of that. Right now it's very difficult, and industry also gave up almost completely on research. My colleague here is from Cambridge. They are one after another company. They're evaluating. Mostly they have a little bit of R&D, but this is about 10% what they used to have.
So, any other comments? You want to comment on that? On the collaborators?
No, I mean, it's Boston. There is a lot of collaborations, but it's really on a case-to-case basis. A lot of the faculty at Harvard or MIT, we are encouraged to start your own startups, and there is a lot of dialogue in trying to take your discovery from the lab to some application. But as he said, it's extremely complex, and each person has a different route. We have grant systems from big companies with Novartis or GlaxoSmithKline, and you have to read the fine print before you commit to it. You can publish, but you have to give them a manuscript 60 days before, and you have to really think hard before working with them.
So any other questions from the audience? No, there's one. No, I'm sorry. I thought I saw a hand up. Okay, so I think we can start to wrap up this the panel. So I think in summary, all of you should be frank and honest with your mentors. Tell them about the problems so we can resolve them quickly. That's one thing. Work for the pursuit of science and your own excellence, rather than seeing the failure of your colleagues or rivals. That's not a good motivation. And if you're not satisfied with your mentor, go change. Go find another one and maybe change a field, or start a collaboration with someone working in a different field who is inspiring to you and with whom you can accomplish something new, right? So if you like to have any closing words, it's a good time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Those are two probably the best closing words. So thank you all for being here until late, and I invite you all to the networking event, which will be in the Klubo Piwiarnia, which is on Narutowicza Street. Go grab a map by the reception. We'll show you where it is, and see you there in a couple of minutes.